Hey class, this is the second video on Plato's Apology, or Socrates' Apologia. Before we get started, two things. One, probably a good idea to go get your textbook. If you don't have it handy, we're going to look at some passages pretty closely. Two, just kind of depending on how I feel at the end of this video, we might end up just breaking this video into two just for your own better learning's sake. So if that happens, just be aware, and the reason I mention it is I think when I wrote the syllabus, I thought there was only going to be two, but it's probably going to be three. So, other than that, let's remind ourselves where we are. Socrates had discussed the old charges. He was unpopular because he was investing the proclamation of the Oracle of Delphi. Discovered Socratic wisdom and realizing the artisans didn't know when they didn't know. And irritated the sophists, the politicians, because they were pursuing rhetoric rather than truth. So, I'm not going to review that a ton since you can watch those videos at your leisure, but this does bring us to the new charges, or what is the same, the official charges in the Apology of denying the gods of Athens, corrupting the youth of Athens. As I mentioned before, denying the gods of Athens, not that serious. And if that's surprising to you, that might be because you're thinking medieval Europe instead of pre-Christian Greece. So there's two reasons this is not a big deal of a charge. First of all, something you might not have known since you grew up in a Christian culture, the vast majority of religions are, your practices are considered much more important than your beliefs, whereas Christianity says that, well, what you believe tends to be more important, in sweeping generalization form. So, for instance, there's lots of conflicting accounts of the Greek gods that we still have, and there was no arguments about whose account was the correct one. That's just not how they thought about religion. Second of all, and perhaps more importantly for this case, it wasn't even that Socrates was denying that there were any gods. The charge wasn't atheism. The charge was denying the gods of Athens. And this came about because Socrates, like his pupil Plato, were ultimately religious reformers in a sense. So Socrates was way ahead of his time. He thought the gods were moral, whereas if you've read some of the Greek mythology, people like to say that the gods were a lot like just more powerful humans. If you've read this, Zeus liked to use his tremendous godly powers to turn into animals and go rape women. And then his wife, goddess Hera, would go punish those women. Socrates says, no, that's bizarre. You're turning gods into humans. You're taking away what's divine and turning them into other humans. So by denying the gods of Athens, read that as Socrates saying, well, the gods aren't really as rapey as you think they are. That's not the kind of claim that's going to get you into a whole lot of trouble in ancient Greece. Having said that, he does still address it a bit. So we could add a couple of quick reasons. One, well, the whole reason he got into this mess in the first place is because he takes the Oracle of Delphi seriously. That seems like he's pretty much committed to the gods. But the reason he gives in the text might need to be unpacked a little. He says, well, I engage in spiritual activity, which entails that I believe in spirits. What is he talking about there? Again, a pretty advanced view for his time. He thought the gods were pure spirit, and the animals were pure body, and humans were this kind of weird bastard offspring with a body and a spirit. Now, what is divine about humans is the spirit, and maybe think of that in terms of mind. The studying ethics, which Socrates turned philosophy towards ethics, and studying knowledge. Again, this is something that's beyond animals. It is cultivating the part of us that seems to rise beyond an animal nature, which he calls the spirit. And you can't believe in spirits, says Socrates, if you don't believe in the gods, because the gods are pure spirit. So, very roughly speaking, that's the depiction he's describing. He sometimes refers to basically his conscience as the gods talking to him. Well, that Doesn't mean he's a schizophrenic or thinks he hears the voices of gods. He just says, well, wait a minute, this is things that animals don't have, and it's part of the spirit. So that's about what he says regarding not denying the gods of Athens. Some very interesting and, again, advanced for the time thoughts there, but Socrates doesn't spend a ton of time on it. So let's move on to the corrupting the youth of Athens. Much more serious charge. Now, first of all, you might think, if this was in your U.S. jurisprudence, he wouldn't have a whole lot to defend himself against here, because there were no witnesses. The prosecution could provide no youth that was corrupted and could provide no youth that testified against Socrates. The prosecution seemed to amount to Miletus and other sophists saying, yep, he sure did that. Well, that doesn't carry much. That's in contemporary court, that's hearsay, and this whole thing would have been dismissed. Having said that, Socrates gives much better reason than that in the Apology, and this takes the form of arguments. I debated whether to do this on the document camera so I could write these out again. Instead, I'm just going to state the premises very slowly. And remember, one of the reasons we are on YouTube is because it has a very nice closed captioning system. If you want to turn on the closed captioning, in order to write these arguments down, feel for it. Probably be very helpful. But both of these arguments are, of course, in the text. And I'm going to start with the deductive one. So this happens when he gets Miletus up on the stand. And so that if you have your textbook, it's page 31. Well, he starts on page 30. If you don't have your textbook, that's fine, because all of Plato's works come with these little marginal numbers and letters on the side called the Stephanus numbers. So this is at Stephanus 24. Gets Miletus on there. It says, okay. Oh, my bad. I was about to start with the informal one, the inductive one. Let's go ahead and start with the deductive one. So this is actually Stephanus 25D. So right at the bottom of the page, come now, do you accuse me here of corrupting the young and making them worse deliberately or unwillingly? Miletus answers, deliberately. What follows, Miletus? Are you so much wiser at your age than I am at mine? Socrates is being a smart ass there. He was like 30 years older than Miletus. That I am, that you understand that wicked people always do some harm to their closest neighbors, while good people do them good? But I have reached such a pitch of ignorance that I do not realize this, namely that if I make one of my associates wicked, I run the risk of being harmed by him. I do not believe you, Miletus, and I do not think anyone else will. Either, it's an either-or argument, either I do not corrupt the young, or if I do, it is unwillingly, and you are lying in either case. If I corrupt them unwillingly, the law does not require you to bring people to court. It's not a crime. You, however, have blah, 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 blah. So that's kind of the end of the argument, that we're now going to take that paragraph and turn it into a standard form argument where we can talk about the premises leading to the conclusion. The conclusion should, roughly speaking, be Socrates doesn't commit a crime. But remember, it's an either-or, so we need to find that key essential either-or. Call this premise one. Sometimes the ancients called it the major premise. Premise one would be something like, any corruption is either unintentional or intentional. So again, premise one, any corruption is either intentional or unintentional. And the reason we like to set it up that way is now I see exactly what Socrates has to do. He says, look, there's two options, and I'm going to show you why either option is going to lead to a verdict of not guilty. So, Socrates already told us, why is it that unintentional corruption would lead to a verdict of not guilty? Premise 2 would be something like, any unintentional corruption is not a crime. Any unintentional corruption is not a crime, premise 2. And that's what the premise is. A lot of times on an exam, I'll ask you to explain an argument. To explain an argument means not just to state the premises, that's listing an argument, but give some reason to think the premises are true. Well, why? Think about arson. If you burn down your house, if you burn down a house intentionally, you're an arsonist. If you burn down a house accidentally, you're an idiot, which is not a crime. And so the Athenian code, it's just not criminal to be an idiot. So now we come to the important third premise. He's already told us why any unintentional corruption would not be criminal. Well, what about the intentional? Socrates says, this is how I would write the premise. Intentional corruption would be to intentionally harm myself, which I would never do. So intentional corruption would be to deliberately harm myself, which I would never do. And that's that passage about the people who are closer to them doing them good or harm. To take a kind of analogous case, imagine we're about ready to complete Unit 1. I invite all the class to my end of Unit 1 party at my place. But imagine that all through Unit 1, I taught you that ethics was BS, that you should do and take absolutely anything you could get away with, etc. If I had 30 people like that in my house, is that going to go well for me? No, it's not. Now, why is that just an analogy? Because when Socrates says harm, he's not talking about physical harm. He's not talking about stuff. He's talking about basically his ethics and his character, who he is as a person, that if he hangs out with all these corrupted people, he's going to corrupt himself, which he would not do. So notice I'm explaining the premise, giving reason to think it's true. So here's the argument then. See if I can remember my wording. Any corruption is unintentional or intentional. In any unintentional corruption, there's no crime. And unintentional corruption would be to corrupt myself, which Socrates wouldn't do. Conclusion, you could add an extra premise if you want. So either there's no crime or Meletus is lying, because Socrates wouldn't do that. Conclusion, therefore, Socrates is not guilty of corrupting the youth. That's, roughly speaking, what this argument would go like. Now, why is this deductive? Because it's supposed to follow from the either or. In fact, if you really wanted to, you can do the counterexample method. It would be something like A or B. If A, then not G. If B, then not G. Therefore, not G. So that would be your counterexample method to try. So that's Socrates' argument, and now it's time to evaluate. So we should be giving 3 things, but we're going to pull together a few threads from the argument subunit. First of all, I already told you it's deductive. It's just supposed to follow from either or. Is it valid? Did the father of Western philosophy give us a valid argument? Well, of course he did. But again, if you actually, assuming it were true that there were only 2 options, assuming option 1 means not guilty, and assuming option 2 means not guilty, would it follow not guilty? Yep. No problem with the validity. And again, validity is never contentious. Validity is facts of logic. People on both sides of an argument are going to agree whether an argument is valid, strong, etc., or they should. So, of course, it's valid. Is it sound? Here's something we have to remember. We talked about arguments whose premises were given by the sciences, and philosophical arguments. This is our first philosophical argument. So how do we do this? Roughly speaking, start by asking, what premises can the sciences tell us are true or false? Roughly speaking, premise one is really a fact of logic. So yes, the sciences can tell us that there's only two options. If you phrase it as intentional or unintentional, there's no third option there. So the sciences can tell us premise one is true. Premise two, that unintentional corruption is not a crime. The sciences tell us that. Yeah, that's a political science question or a history question. The sciences will tell us, yes, that was true about Athenian jurisprudence during that time. So notice, and this is a great thing that we're ultimately going to talk about in the discussion, the entire evaluation then hinges on premise three, that if we hang out with corrupt people, it corrupts ourselves, and that Socrates is not the kind of person who would corrupt himself. That's the kind of thing that, well, since, corrupt and unethical, and these are philosophical definitions, that's our philosophical premise. And what does that mean? How do we evaluate philosophical premises? We look at the support, sometimes called the sub-arguments, and ask, do I have better reason to believe premise three is true? Or do I have better reason to believe premise three is false, or at least you haven't convinced me that it's true? Reasonably convinced. So that's why we have to look at Socrates' reasoning. Do the reasons Socrates give in that paragraph I have read, and based on our common experience in life, give me better reason to think that, that it's probably true that if you hang out with corrupt people, it harms you morally, and that Socrates wouldn't harm himself morally. If Socrates has convinced you on those points, you have better reason to call the premise true than false, which means you would call that argument sound, which means you have to accept the conclusion. If you think that Socrates hasn't been persuasive there, that you don't have good reason to think that premise is true, even after Socrates' support and what you know in life, then you're not going to call that premise true, even if you don't know whether it's true or false. You can't call it true. And so if Socrates hasn't convinced you on that premise, then you call the argument unsound. Now remember, calling an argument unsound doesn't mean you have to say Socrates did corrupt the youth. You just have to say this argument doesn't convince me. So do some philosophy. In this case, we have the importance of logical reasoning. We know what his argument is. We know it's valid. We know what the sciences tell us, which means the only disagreement, and what's going to tie essentially to the evaluation, is that premise three. To say premise three is good is to say the argument's good, and that they must therefore accept the conclusion. To say that he hasn't convinced us on premise three is to say the argument is unsound, and we don't have to accept it. So do some philosophy. Be ready to talk about in the recitation on the apology and in the discussion periods on discussion boards online. Tell me about that argument, but be sure you structure it correctly. This is about premise three, period. So what do we think about premise three and therefore the argument? That's how these work. Let's go to the other argument, which again I accidentally started to read a little earlier. Socrates gets Meletus on the stand and effectively gets him to admit all Athenians, it seems, make the young and divine good men except me, and I alone corrupt them. Is that what you mean? Meletus, that is most definitely what I mean. So that's important, and then Socrates goes on, it's Stephanus 25b. You condemn me to a great misfortune. Does this apply to horses, do you think? That all men improve them and one individual corrupts them? Or is quite the contrary true? One individual is able to improve them, or very few, whereas the minority, if they have horses and use them, corrupt them. So that's the inductive argument, why he's drawing a specific type of disanalogy there. So we don't need to get too far into the logic, but this is an instance of what's called reductio ad absurdum, where you show that your opponent's position leads to absurdity, and that therefore their position must be rejected. And that's why it's important that Socrates gets Meletus to state this position. So premise one might be something like, if Meletus is correct, everyone else improves the youth, and only Socrates corrupts them. But it has to be put as a hypothetical. If Meletus is correct, then he's ultimately going to show Meletus is not correct. So, if Meletus is correct, everyone else improves the youth, only Socrates harms them. But now we come to the analogy. Socrates says, wait a minute, and this is probably premise two, with horses, very few improve, and the vast majority corrupt. So, that's the premise. With horses, very, very few improve, the vast majority corrupt. But again, if we're explaining an argument instead of just listing the premises, why think that's true? I have not raised horses. Having said that, I think I see what Socrates is getting at. I have raised a dog, a very large dog. So I was trying to be incredibly careful when he was a puppy, because he'll be big enough to hurt somebody someday, and I knew this even back then. So here's something that happened. I was training my dog. If he does something wrong that could be dangerous later, I'd give him a little swat on the nose and swat. Just this very little light tap, except my dog would very dramatically fall on the ground and go, "Arr!" And my significant other at the time would then run over and hug the dog and tell him what a good boy he was. In that situation, who's improving the dog and who's corrupting, so to speak? If nothing else, the dog's getting mixed messages, which is going to be dangerous later because he's a big dog. And so my significant other at the time was basically impeding the training by giving these mixed messages or telling him he was good when he had in fact done something wrong. And that would be dangerous later. So I think that might be the kind of thing we're talking about with horses. So that's a reason to think the premise is true, even if you haven't dealt with horses. So premise three, though, put those together. Put together Meletus' claim that only Socrates harms and everyone else improves, and put that together with the fact that with horses it's the exact opposite. If you put those two together, and this is premise three, that would imply that it is much, 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 much easier to raise a good horse than a good human. You don't have to put 8 muches in there, but you get the idea. It's premise. This implies it's overwhelmingly easier to raise a good horse than a good human, which is crazy. Feel free to put which is crazy in the premise, and you might say, is crazy relevant? To induction, yes, because remember, crazy means very, very improbable, means we shouldn't believe it. There's inductive arguments against crazy claims. If one of you told me there was an elephant wandering around in the quad, I'd say, that's crazy, I don't believe it without further evidence. A very, very, very bizarre claim requires very, 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 very strong evidence. And so the fact that Meletus' claim has such a crazy entailment is relevant here, because it means, like the elephants in the quad, it should be rejected unless you can give overwhelming evidence to think that it's easier to raise a human than a horse. Which, of course, it's not. I mean, the horse can't steal your car and drive it through a wall. I have a daughter who's about to be 2 years old, and man, I'm terrified about, I have to teach her right from wrong and why we should be ethical and, how to be wise and how to avoid fallacious reasoning. I feel like these kind of things, and then, have to worry about her dating when she's a teenager. Trust me, I would rather raise it. In terms of ease, I would think it would be much, much, much easier to raise a horse. So, there we have the argument, roughly speaking. If Meletus' claim is correct, only Socrates harms and everyone else improves. With horses, it's the opposite. This implies craziness. Feel free to, with premise 3, that's a fine way to state premise 3. This would lead to a crazy inference that it's much easier to raise a good horse than a good human. Conclusion, we reject Meletus' original claim. We just say, no, it's not. Meletus must be saying something false there. Which, again, since all Socrates needs to establish is not guilty, that's really enough. So, that's the second, first chronologically, but that's the inductive argument. All right. What is philosophical there, and what is provided by the science? Oh, sorry. It's inductive. Assuming all premises were true, that Meletus' claim leads to craziness, would we accept the conclusion that his claim is wrong? Yes. In terms of induction and probability, Meletus' claim is probably wrong if it has bizarre entailments. No problem there. Of course, that argument is strong. So now we look at the premises. What premises did the sciences inform us about? Well, sciences, roughly speaking, in the Russell science versus philosophy distinction. Did Meletus make this claim? Yep, we have it in writing. He did it while he was on the stand. No problem. Premise 1, the sciences tell us is true. Premise 2 about horse rearing, that's something about the sciences. But the sciences tell us that very few improve the horse while the rest corrupt. I've talked to some horse people about this, and they say, yep, that's correct. So I'm willing to say the sciences call premise 2 true. Once more, the whole romp is in premise 3. If put another way, that it is crazy. Is it true that it's crazy to think, or at least wrong to think, that it's easier to raise humans than horses? So, I think I might have said that at one point backwards. But anyway, that's the claim. So just be careful. Don't make sure you capture my meaning, not my exact words, if I can say that backwards. But yeah, Meletus' claim implies it's easier to raise humans than horses. That's a philosophical premise because we have to talk about in terms of what it means to raise a good human and a good horse and what have you. So, if based on your common life experience and what Socrates tells you, if you think it is in fact harder to raise a good human than a good horse, then you'll call premise 3 true because yes, it is crazy to claim the opposite. And therefore, you'll call the argument cogent and must agree that, yes, Socrates is not guilty of corrupting the youth. However, if Socrates hasn't convinced you, if you say, well, I still don't know if it's true that, or false, if it's weird to think, that premise is tricky because making it true is to say the claim is crazy. Calling it false is to say the claim is not crazy. And so it does get a little bit backwards in our minds. But yeah, if I'm not really sure whether it's harder to raise a human or a horse, I'm not convinced by premise 3. Call the argument uncogent. I can't say all premises are true, and so you haven't persuaded me to the conclusion, Socrates. So, again, I'd love to hear on the discussion board what we think about this philosophical premise and therefore the philosophical argument, because the cogency hinges on it. Also, if you just want to talk a little more generally about whether you think Socrates was guilty or not guilty and why, again, you should be connecting them to the arguments, but if you want to bring in, he did mention several other brief reasons, even though we're focusing on these. Love to hear your thoughts on that. I have officially decided that I do want to make a break here, and we'll do a third apology video because I want you to go do something else. Before we finish, I want you to go back in the text because there's another argument to dig out. So we know what the verdict is, but what I want you to do, Socrates is going to give us 3 reasons why he's not afraid of death. So again, 3 reasons you're not afraid of death. Of those 3 reasons, one of them is an argument. And in fact, it's a deductive argument whose structure is identical to the either or one we just looked at. So before you watch the next video, now that you kind of see how it's done, find that argument in the text, write it out, should be same structure, 3 premises. One is an either-or leading to a conclusion that he does not fear death. And then find those other 2 reasons as well. And there's a lot of important kind of philosophical meat about why he doesn't fear death. And so I do think I'll go ahead and make a break here, so there'll be 3 apology videos total. I apologize, but we'll see you then with the next one.